I think the biggest thing to talk about is that this is a challenge for everybody, including the educators who often aren't trained and don't understand a lot of the complex medical and mental health issues that our kids have, let alone, they may feel inadequate, or they may have unrealistic expectations, or unrealistic expectations are made of them. It's also a challenge for parents and caregivers, as we well know, being involved in this, but they're also not trained and they don't have an understanding of those same systems that the educators don't, but they also don't understand the educational system, and we parents aren't teachers either. So add on to that, all the fear, frustration of, trying to deal with this day in and day out, it creates a lot of challenges. And there are challenges for the students. No student wants to feel different. They want to fit in. They want to have friends. They want to be a typical child. And they start to recognize that they're maybe a little different, and that creates a lot of challenges for them. So we add all of this together and try to find a way to use the schools to help our kiddos. So schools exist to serve individuals as well as the community in a structured environment. That's actually what their task is. They have a requirement for child find, and child find is a responsibility to identify children with special needs and provide them their free and appropriate public education, their FAPE. And thankfully, just recently, some things have progressed to the point that when we talk about making progress, it has to be significant progress. It has to be meaningful progress. It can't just be a little bit. It may not be a year's worth of progress like our typical kids are making, but it has to be something that's meaningful. So a free and appropriate public education is guaranteed by 3 laws: the Right to Education Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, and the Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Feel free to look those up. I've read them. If you're a geek, you'll love it. Supporting documents in Ohio specifically are the operating standards. There's one for Ohio schools. There's one for schools that serve children with disabilities. There's the academic content standards that talk about, curriculum. And there's a guide to parent rights in the special education process, which also touches on the rights of children and students. And you can find these on the Ohio Department of Education's website at ode.state.ohio.us. So in order to receive federal assistance, the states must demonstrate that they have policies and procedures that fulfill these requirements. Unfortunately, there is a gap between the law and the implementation. ODE does exist to help us with that, but their hands are tied in a lot of ways. So there is a significant under-identification of children with special needs. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I listed some of them here, but there are a lot of reasons why there's an under-identification of children. I'll just leave it at that. Children whose disability impacts learning, they must receive access when needed to special education or related services. And they must be designed to meet a child's educational needs. The reason that we often call it an IEP is because it's individualized. That's what the I stands for. So programs have to meet the individual needs of these students. And there are a variety of ways that can be done. The most typical are the intervention assistant teams, the response to intervention, a 504 plan, or an individualized education plan. So, who is a child with a disability when we talk about education? It's not necessarily any child with a diagnosis. It's any person who's under the age of 22 whose disability adversely affects their educational performance. And there are categories. There are 13 categories that have been identified. I've listed them here. I've highlighted the ones that we often deal with: the autism, the emotional disturbance, the intellectual disability, the multiple disabilities, the other health impairments, and the specific learning disability. But there are certainly others there with traumatic brain injuries, visual hearing impairments, deafness, but it has to adversely affect their child's educational performance. And so that's kind of subjective. So, parents and providers might think that it does, and schools might say, no, we don't see that here at school. We don't think that it's affecting their educational performance. Or they might say, well, despite the child having a diagnosis, when they're at school, they're getting A's and B's. So it's really not adversely affecting their educational performance. So there's a process to go through. I don't have a lot of time to go through this whole process. It would take me at least an hour to explain all of this to you. I'm happy to do that outside of this if anyone needs more information. But typically, someone brings up that, a parent, a teacher, a counselor, or someone says, I think this child needs help at school. And then the schools convene some type of a team to assess whether or not a child needs some type of help. And they may choose to do a response to intervention where they put a few things in place and keep some data and see, well, does this work? Is this helping the child? They may just say, you know what, yes, this child has some significant problems. We need to evaluate this child. We'll do an ETR, we'll put a report together, and we'll come together as a team and talk about maybe a more formal type of individualized program. So that ETR process is it's overseen by a school psychologist. So that helps. There are planning forms that are standard that talk about all of the areas in which a child could be evaluated. And that really helps parents and people that aren't educators to know what the different areas are. And you can go through each one and say, well, do we need more information on this? Do we have enough information on that? And go down the list. In order to continue on with this process, they need a parent's consent. And if a child is placed in the custody of the state, then they would need to have a surrogate parent's consent. So there's always the requirement that a parent consents, whether it's the actual caregiver that is the child's living with, or whether it's some type of a surrogate parent that is assigned. There are timelines that have to be followed, such as this testing has to be done within 60 days. And usually to start the process, the school wants some type of a letter documenting what the child's disability is. I usually encourage people not to put too much information in that letter, not that you can't share all of the information in a meeting or down the road, but in that letter, they just need to know that there's a diagnosis. This child was diagnosed with autism. This child was diagnosed with a mental health condition of anxiety, depression, whatever. This child, has some kind of a complex medical issue, and these are the diagnoses. Once that testing is done, the team comes together, and the team includes parents, teacher, some type of a representative from the district, and they talk about, what did this evaluation show? Where are the needs? Where are the strengths of this child? They determine whether or not they're going to develop an IEP. Did they find that he's eligible for an individualized education plan? Do they think that they can just help him maybe through a 504, which typically gives accommodations to students where they maybe don't need specially designed instruction, but they need just some help with frequent breaks, or maybe somebody to do some reading for them because they're not reading at grade level. Maybe they need a communication device. Maybe they need some counseling at school. Maybe they need to check in with a nurse because they have some type of a complex medical issue. But all of those things are available, and anything that a team determines is needed in a school setting in order for a child to make progress is on the table. So don't be afraid to think outside of the box and ask for whatever this child needs to be successful in their school placement. So a little more information on 504 plans. It's really about accommodations. It's through the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which talks about Americans with disabilities. So think of it as, helping, what can we do to change the environment to help this kiddo? There are no protections for a child with behavior issues like there are on an IEP. So if there are significant behavioral issues or social skill challenges, there's probably a need for some specially designed instruction, which would mean that there's a need for an individualized education plan. And then there are some protections under that plan for kids so that they can't be expelled or suspended. Oftentimes there's disagreements and disputes, but there are ways to address those, from case conferences to filing due process to, having a hearing officer decide what needs to happen in the next step. That's all outlined in some of those documents that you can get at the Ohio Department of Education. We write the IEP, we talked about that. I like to have a whole slide about the discipline and suspension, just in case any of you are dealing with that. Often I see that with our kids with mental health issues. So there is a formal process if a child has been suspended for 10 days or more, and that's to help schools not continue to suspend kids with disabilities and not provide them their education. So after 10 days, whether it's 10 days at one time or 2 days here, 5 days here, 3 days here, they need to do something called a manifestation determination, where they get together and they talk about, was this behavior a manifestation of the child's disability? And if it was, they need to do a functional behavior assessment, figure out what is the function of that behavior. They need to talk about how can we teach skills to prevent that child from having that behavior. And they need to return that child to his educational placement. They can't just decide to send him to an alternative school unless the parents are on board with that, unless the IEP team is on board with that. And any changes to placement have to also be signed off on by the parent or the surrogate parent. So again, there's that protection that someone who is really only has the best interest of that child has to sign off on something as large as a placement change. Expulsions, there are only 3 reasons why a child can be expelled who's on an IEP: if they use a weapon or carry a weapon to school, if they knowingly possess or use illegal drugs, or if they have done serious bodily harm to another person. And I mean serious bodily harm. I know of a case where a student broke a teacher's arm and they didn't consider that serious bodily harm. I don't know if I would necessarily agree with that, but it really has to be serious bodily harm to prevent, some of these lower level kind of acting out things, to prevent them from having kids removed for up to 45 days, because that's also traumatic to a kid. To be moved constantly for behavior is also traumatizing. So we talk about the least restrictive environment. That's one of the requirements on an IEP, is where does the child receive services? And the law says that they need to receive it in the least restrictive environment. So schools are required to have all types of environments, from the regular education class in a typical school all the way to hospitals and residential facilities and everything in between. And that needs to be discussed. And again, if you're going to change that least restrictive environment, a parent needs to sign off on that so that everyone is clear when that child is being removed from having their services and education with their typical peers. There's a place on the IEP to talk about transitioning to adulthood, and I think that's an area that is often underused. There are lots of opportunities to put goals in place, including goals that can help you with your living challenges. If you're a kiddo that needs help with figuring out how to use public transportation, or needs help learning how to call and make an appointment, or how do I talk to the pharmacy to get my medication, or let alone things like how do I fill out a job application, or how do I create a resume, or where do I go if I need help with post-secondary education. Again, don't be afraid to think outside of the box in this category, because if you can think it and the child needs it, it can be put on there. I gave a list of accommodations. I'm not really going to talk about them, but I just wanted to if you guys get this, to have a list that shows there are lots of out-of-the-box things. And don't be afraid, again, to, if you think a child would benefit, or you can show that a child benefits from this at home, or in their occupational therapy or physical therapy outside of school, bring it to the table to the school and see if it's something that needs to be done and supported at school as well. Modifications are something that often happen for our kiddos. A modification is when you're changing what the child is learning. So if you're talking about math and you're saying, oh, well, kids are going to learn how to do multiplication and division. And in third grade, we're doing, multiplication and division with 3 places. So they're, doing 300 divided by 10. And maybe this kiddo just isn't there, but he can maybe do 10 divided by 3. So that would be a modification, because he would still be learning to do math and the same concept as the kids, but it would be different. In science, instead of learning all of the planets and about all of the planets and all of the moons, maybe that kid only has to learn just to name the planets and the locations of them, because he doesn't need to have all of the information about what gases and what each planet looks like as far as the makeup of, is there water on that planet, or what do the moons do, or so you can make this fit for whatever a child needs. So maybe in math they need help, but in the other areas they don't. Maybe, when it comes to writing, they just really aren't able to produce, 3 paragraphs in a paper, or 5 paragraph papers. So you limit what they're going to do. That's a modification. Some additional areas on the IEP that I wanted to make sure to just kind of touch on is there's an area for future planning where the team talks about what they'd like to see for this kiddo. That should always include a statement from the student as well, short-term and long-term goals. There's a profile that kind of outlines everything that we looked at in the evaluation that we think applies strengths and weaknesses for this child. There are goals, individual goals that are created. We talk about specially designed instruction and what that looks like for each child, for each goal. There's a place for assistive technology. There's a place for related services such as counseling or occupational therapy or physical therapy or anything that might be needed. There's also an area for transportation. So if a child needs transportation to and from school because he's not able, all the other kids walk who are in a 2-mile within 2 miles of the school, but this kiddo suffers from ADHD or autism and would get lost or get sidetracked on the way to school, they might need special transportation on their IEP to make sure they get there, and they're entitled to have that. Behavior plans should always be added to IEPs so that we're sure that there's the protection that it will be followed, because an IEP is a legal binding document. There's also an area to talk about non-academic and extracurricular activities. And oftentimes I see statements in this section that say, oh, the child's able to participate in anything that he or she would choose. But we need to take that a step further and maybe document, what does that child need in order to participate in those extracurricular activities? If that child has an aid all day at school to kind of keep him focused and moving in the right direction and make sure that things go as they're planned, he might need that aid in an extracurricular activity. So that would be a place where you can say, the child would be provided with the aid. It is actually a given, but a lot of schools don't always say that if it's a service that's provided to a student in an IEP, that they get to have that same service at an extracurricular activity or a non-academic such as sports. So don't be afraid to document it there. And there's an area for statewide assessments. And just talks about what kind of accommodations a child could get, such as maybe the use of a calculator or getting frequent breaks or extended Some additional information, the required members of an IEP team are the parents, the teacher, the regular ed teacher, the special ed teacher, and a district representative from the school. It talks about the timelines. I like to remind people that summer breaks don't count in those timelines. So if you start the process in May, that doesn't mean that school ends in June and you get to come back in September and pick up the timeline again. The timeline continues through the summer. And I think I made it just in my 15 minutes. Woo, thank you.